Welcome to the Books and Travel podcast. I'm Jo Frances Penn, thriller and dark fantasy author, bringing you escape and inspiration about unusual and fascinating places, as well as the deeper side of books and travel. You can find the episode show notes at booksandtravel.page, and if you enjoy thrillers set in international locations, download one of my ebooks for free at jfpen.com/free. Hello travellers, I'm Jo Frances Penn, and today I'm talking with Nadine Slavinski about sailing across the Pacific and the joys and challenges that Nadine and her family faced along the way, as well as the cultures they experienced and how those places inspired stories and further trips. It was also interesting to hear about the more practical aspects of working up to such a long passage, and how you can achieve a huge lifelong dream if you just take it step by step. Back in episode 1, I talked about how sailing on a tall ship from Fiji to Vanuatu in the South Pacific helped change the direction of my life, and I still vividly remember my hours on watch at the bow. Nadine's words brought back those memories, and her description of the stars at night over the Pacific are magical. I hope you enjoy the interview today. Nadine Slavinski is an archaeologist turned teacher whose sailing adventures inspire her fiction and non-fiction books. Welcome, Nadine.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
I'm excited to talk to you today. So let's start with your book, Pacific Crossing, which in itself just brings to mind all these different things. So what is the coconut milk run, and what are some of your highlights from that trip?
I guess a milk run refers to, in the old days, a milkman would go and do the standard route. So sailors speak of crossing the Atlantic as the milk run because over time and over the centuries, really, up through the modern day, there's kind of a standard way to do it. And the same goes for the Pacific. So the Pacific version, or the route, is known as the coconut milk run, but it's probably better envisioned as stepping stones. There's a very logical route across the Pacific. The wind goes more or less from east to west, taking you on your way, and it leads you. You almost can't help but following a certain route across the Pacific. So about the first half of the Pacific, you, in a way, don't have a choice. So most 99% of sailors these days leave, well, as they have for centuries, leave from Panama. And then it's for a boat, like we had a 35-foot sailboat. It took us a week to get to the Galapagos from there. Then there's the big open part, the biggest, longest piece of the Pacific. It took us 28 days from Galapagos to get to the Marquesas. So now you're in the French territory, and so on and so on. So then you go across the Marquesas, the Tuamotus, the Society Islands. Then you get into the direction of Samoa, eventually the Cook Islands, Tonga, Fiji, and then on to New Zealand or Australia. Then the route splits a little bit after the Society Islands. But it's kind of the standard route, and it's or even as a sailor, you might be surprised how many people are actually out there doing it. We sailed, my husband and I, with our then 7-year-old son, and there are a number of families in their boats sailing the same route. And you buddy up and you have a buddy boat, and you meet in the Galapagos, and you're like, okay, we'll see you in the Marquesas in a month from now. And then you might meet in an anchorage and spend some time together like that. So that's roughly how it works.
Already I'm like, oh, all these different places. So you mentioned, for example, the Marquesas have a French feeling. I think some of the other Pacific islands do. But what are some of the different cultures that you see on the route?
Yeah, it's so many from the indigenous cultures that you're leaving behind in Panama to the Galapagos, where you've got the Ecuadorians coming over from the mainland, and then all of a sudden, so you're speaking Spanish at that part of the trip, and all of a sudden you've kind of flip a switch and go into, you speak French and they speak French, but of course they have their island languages as well. And apparently, from what I understand, so Tahitian is the language spoken in Tahiti. And if you're from the Marquesas, I think it's a little bit like me talking to you, or worse, me talking to a Texan or somebody from Glasgow. I think that was the hardest accent I ever had to try to make out. So they can talk to each other, but it sounds a little different. And as you get further west, you get more into Melanesian cultures instead of Polynesian cultures. So the whole flavor kind of changes gradually as you go. There's that land aspect, but there's also that it's really interesting. If you look at the map of the Pacific, it looks empty in quote unquote, but of course it's not. It's mostly water, yes, but it has these little tiny dots of islands. But we spent almost as much time in between. And that's just the beauty of sailing to me, is that those 28 days that we spent getting to the Marquesas in the first place, you're at sea 24 hours, you never stop, right? So for 28 days, you don't see land, and you're taking turns being on watch, because it's not like, you just close the door and go to sleep somehow, right? Somebody's always awake, looking at the horizon. And as you travel, you're in not the footsteps, but the wake, I suppose, of so many sailors through history, through centuries before you. And then eventually, that the island appears on the horizon, and you see the mountaintop. Or first you see the clouds, and then you might see the mountaintop, and you'll see birds. And at some point the smells hit you. So you have this obviously great excitement getting to any place that you travel like that takes a long time, like walking, maybe like biking, where you've really earned it in a way. And then you get there and you're really ready to explore where you've landed.
I've done one blue water trip, 7 days from Fiji to Vanuatu a long time ago now. And though the 7 days of out of sight of land, as you say, that's quite a magical time. And I remember the time on watch quite well, because there's the ocean to look at, but actually there wasn't much else. But it was a very meditative time. But this was on a much bigger boat with a lot of crew. And of course, this is just you and your husband and your son. So how does that work? Like you say, 24 hours on watch and off and sleeping and navigating and all those things. How did you do that? And is that a very stressful time, or is that actually quite relaxing and meditative as well?
It can be both. And the length of the passage has nothing to do with it. The weather, you are a slave to the weather, much more than we are in our cozy lives here in our secure homes with the walls that keep out the wind and the heating or the air conditioning. So you're really at the mercy of the weather. And for us, that 28-day passage was, the first 2 days were kind of rough, leaving the Galapagos. There's a lot of swirling currents and a lot of contrary winds as you go through the intertropical convergence zone, and then you get out of that, and then the rest was just magic, just 26 days of pure magic, where it was just steady, the dream of the trade winds. They're just sailing, pushing you along as you go. So how it works is we did 4-hour watches. So for example, I would be 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. would be me. So my husband could sleep at that time. Then he would do 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. So I was off, and then 2 to 6. And 6 to 10 and night. And now we're getting into night, right? So one of us would then be asleep, and then you wake up the other person at 10 p.m. and they're on watch until 2 a.m. And then the other person comes on at 6 a.m. So it's just the two of us, because our son was too young he would come up and sleep next to us, sleep next to us while we kept watch sometimes. But so it's just the two of us in that 24-hour constant cycle. And it takes a few days to fall into that, but as long as the weather's good, it can be relaxing. So if you add it up, technically you're on for 12 hours, but technically you have 12 hours off. So you could sleep as much as you want, but it's broken up into maximum 4-hour chunks. And you don't, so in a small sailboat, I think people imagine being behind the wheel and looking at the sails and such. So we had a self-steering device. So I love the beauty of these things. It wasn't electric. It's not powered at all. Like a mini sail off the back of your boat that goes to its own little rudder, and you can set that, and it steers the boat on a constant course to the wind. So you don't actually have to stand there and sail. So the 4 hours that I was on, let's say in the middle of the night, you come up, I had my 3 cookies that I got for midnight watch, and you come up, you scan the horizon regularly. We just spent the entire 4 hours in the cockpit. You might be reading a book, but you're always in the cockpit, always keeping a lookout, because there might be other boats, fishing boats. Of course, in the Pacific, we saw a boat maybe every 4 days, a light, on the horizon kind of thing. But mostly it's just you and the stars. And the stars are probably the most magical thing. And specifically on that trip, what was so amazing to me is I think we were roughly going on a line of about 6 degrees south of the equator, going from east to west. Once we got away from the Galapagos, going towards the Marquesas. And that is a latitude where you can see the Southern Cross. So picture yourself, you're sailing forwards, which is west, and to your left on the southern horizon is the Southern Cross. And on your right in the north, you can still see Polaris, the North Star. And to me, it was just magical. It was almost like being a little airport runway in the sense of, that they have the lights to guide them to stay on course. And just how many places in the world can you see both at once? Not very many. And to just kind of, steady. The one is always in the north and one is always in the south. Because obviously with Earth rotation, the stars move at night, but those two are pretty much, they appear almost fixed. So it's just really magical. On the other hand, going from, that was 28 days of almost bliss. Going from Fiji to Vanuatu was just, I think, 3 or 4 days. No, the worst one was Vanuatu to New Caledonia. It was only 3 days. Horrendous 3 days. We had squalls. We had really rough seas. And a lot of that, interestingly, it doesn't just come from a storm, but the underwater profile. So all of a sudden, there's a lot of seamounts in that. So you might look at it as an open stretch of ocean, but between Vanuatu and New Caledonia, so now that's over in the Western Pacific as you're getting more towards Australia, it's a very rough patch of water because these underwater seamounts actually kick up as the waves pass over them, even though they're still hundreds of feet below. It's a very unsettled surface. So the comfort level has nothing to do with the length of the passage. It's entirely to do with the weather and the conditions.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, of course, I think all of us would love the dream and the trade winds and the stars and the occasional dolphin, and that would just be wonderful. But of course, as you mentioned there, the weather and the stress of the other times. And I think that's what makes a lot of people afraid, certainly makes me afraid. I mean, I was terribly seasick in the first 24 hours, and there's a lot of primal fear about being out on the ocean like that. So how have you tackled those fears and overcome these challenges?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And in a sense, I never got over, I'm not a fearless person. And you do meet those people that just set off and they have, they're only excited and they have no fear. Every time, right before we set off a passage, I had butterflies, you couldn't eat, no matter how many. We lived on a boat for a total of 4 years. We sailed all the way from as far east in Greece to east. It's all circled, but that's how I view it, all the way to Australia. And every time we left for a new passage, I had that butterfly nervous feeling. And it's that fear of the unknown. But that's what you do it for, kind of, right? Because we think about in some ways, here we are on lockdown, you develop a routine, and routines are very healthy in some ways. But of course, we also talk about wanting to get out and to escape that. So there's that. Another really important driver to me, despite all those fears, is very natural fears. Well, first, of course, I would talk myself, tell yourself the practicality. And apparently, statistically, sailing is safer than driving on a highway. I totally believe that. And I believe I was told it was safer statistically than playing golf. You got to remember that. But my greatest driver, in a sense, is my father. My father was born behind the Iron Curtain, and he escaped as a young man, came to America. He was always dreaming about sailing, and he always talked about someday I'll sail around the world. And that's how I learned to sail, with my dad in very small, very old, beat up boats, just off the beach kind of thing. And it was always his dream. And so I kind of got that dream, and I read the books that he read, Thor Heyerdahl, and all these kind of sea adventure books, and I couldn't wait to go someday. And sadly, when I was 15 and he was 45, he got cancer and he died. So he never got to realize that dream. And of course, at a young age, that leaves a big impression on you. It took until I was 35, but I did it. I didn't sail around the world, but I sailed 2/3 of the way across around the world. And that fear of not accomplishing it was always the biggest driver. That, of course, sometimes it's healthy to back out. That you're just off the tip of Everest and you really should turn back, and you're so tempted. You're like, oh, but I'm so close. So, of course, there are moments when it's safer not to go. But in that general fear of the unknown, that always got me over the hump. That, this has always been my dream, and here I am accomplishing it. Not just for me, maybe for him in a way too.
And okay, so you did start sailing young there with your dad, but did you do specific training for these longer passages? Did you work up to the bigger trip over years, or I mean, how did you address that? Because obviously there's a lot, even though you have the technology, you have the self-steering you mentioned, and there are navigation tools that mean you don't need to use the stars. But did you train specifically for the longer journey?
Yeah, it was a dream for so long. And even before I married my husband, I was talking about it. And he was the practical one going, yeah, maybe someday. So we're maybe a good combination, as I'm the dreamer and he's the practical one. So over years, until we finally convinced him to really take the plunge, we did work our way up. And if anybody's, I know you have a mixed audience, but if anybody's thinking about doing it, I really recommend working your way up, because you meet people along the way who give up, who have a terrible experience because they jump into the deep end and they didn't work up. So what we did is we chartered. And the first charter we took was like a group charter. So like everybody had their own sailboat. There were like 10 different sailboats, but one of them had a professional crew. And they would meet in the morning and they would say, okay, today we're going from here to there in Greece and so on. So you kind of had a safety net. Another time we chartered and we were starting to feel more confident about a bigger boat and navigating on our own in unknown places. So we actually did a charter where the first 3 days we had a professional captain with us, and we did everything right kind of thing. And that just gave us the extra confidence. And then he stepped off the boat and we had the rest of the week to ourselves. We volunteered to help deliver boats. We did that in the Mediterranean, and that really helped us get the overnight. So getting overnight is the most critical thing. It's one thing to sail in sight of land, but to sail off at night and navigate by lighthouse blinking and that kind of thing. So we did a 5-day passage in the Mediterranean. And then when we finally bought our boat, in Mallorca and we kept it in Sardinia. So that was a 3-day trip. So we did short little trips like that. So we did a 24-hour trip. We did a 72-hour trip. And the Mediterranean was a very good proving ground, as is, let's say, the Caribbean. And we worked our way up. So at some point, yes, you do have to take the plunge. So at one point we're in Greece and we're looking at Malta, and that was 7 days away. And that seemed like forever. And of course, it's like a year later, we got to Panama, and you're looking across the Pacific, and the Pacific is a whole different ballgame. So it's many thousands of miles across and no chance to resupply. You really have to be independent for very long stretches. So we definitely worked our way up, and that really gave us the confidence that we weren't doing something crazy for us or for our child. And in fact, it was one of the most magical times of our lives. Just the three of us together on a boat. Before that, my husband was going off to business travel all the time. We were like three people. Even my son was kind of like a worker, right? Going to kindergarten. You go in 3 different directions. You spend the day completely apart. On a boat, of course, you might think, okay, you're spending it too much together, but you get used to it. And we felt it was really magical to be a team, the three of us together. And we each had our little roles that some were better than others. But that is something that has stayed with us for years. So it's been a couple of years now. We got back in 2014 from Australia, where we sailed to Australia, sold our boat there and flew back. But that has never left us. And I think that's the precious thing that I can really take out of this is you're constantly problem solving. You're constantly encountering fears and issues. All of a sudden, this is broken or that's broken, or where are we going to get water? And you work through it together. And I think it's also valuable for a child to see their parents grapple. A lot of times your parents might go to the kitchen, close the door, and talk about the serious issues, right? Mm. And we had all those conversations, right, with our son there. Big storm coming, what do we do? Or should we leave now, or should we stay at this island, et cetera, et cetera. So that was another really magical aspect, actually.
And I wondered, because you mentioned magical, and I was thinking again of that sort of looking out the stars and that time on watch. And once you're more confident with the practicalities, which, as you talked about, really great way to learn in the way that you did it. So once you're comfortable and you're sitting there and you're enjoying it, did you have any sort of spiritual experiences? Because I definitely felt, when I did my little bit of it, that I understood much more why pretty much every culture has gods of the sea and spirits of the ocean and things like that, because you do feel, and maybe it's a bit about being out of control and realizing everything's bigger than you. But did you have that sort of spiritual aspect of the journeys?
I would say not so explicitly that I put it in that category in my mind, but very much that vulnerability mixed with sense of wonder of being this tiny, tiny speck on a very big sea, completely exposed to whatever fate or whatever you want to call it, to whatever it pushes your way. There's that aspect. And certainly 28 days out of sight of land, where you wake up in the middle of the night to do your 4 hours and you're not just looking at the stars, you're thinking about all kinds of things. So it gives you that time for introspection. And then, of course, our interactions with different cultures on different islands. I think we'll get to talking about Vanuatu later, just seeing the world through other people's eyes, or getting glimpses, at least, through some people are very spiritual or very just a different sense of, what is my place in the world? It's very easy in the Western world. I'm the center of my universe, aren't I? And when you live in a boat, or if you live in a very small island in the middle of the Pacific, you realize that no, you're not. In a way, you're the center of your universe, but you realize how big that universe is and how far it goes beyond you.
You mentioned Vanuatu there, and having been there, I still remember it very well. We sailed in, and as you mentioned, the shallows there and navigating through the coral reefs and stuff. And we arrived, and amusingly, some of the villagers came out in canoes. And, you have this terribly Western view of people coming out in canoes. And then they arrive and there's this Nike swoosh, just do it, on the end of one of the canoe paddles, sort of stenciled on. And then this was back in 1999, so it wasn't cell phone-tastic, but everyone has cell phones now. But we walked up the Ambrim volcano, and I had no real idea of what the Pacific Islands were like, except for these sort of golden sand beaches. So I wondered what else you experienced that people might be surprised about.
Yeah, and Vanuatu is a great example, because I'd never even heard of Vanuatu before. Even as a sailor, even reading so many different accounts and dreaming and looking at maps, my attention, you always hear about Tahiti and the Society Islands and maybe the Galapagos and places like Fiji. We've all seen the images. And then there's Vanuatu, which I think was the New Hebrides before it became an independent country, and its proper name is Vanuatu. And to us, it was like stepping into a National Geographic magazine. That's how we saw it. And yes, there are some, 1 out of 20 people might be wearing shoes, and there might be Nikes. So yes, the outside world is coming in, but it's still so traditional. And there's, I think, a gradient from south to north. So Vanuatu is a country made up of little islands spread out north to south, very much linear north to south. And it's as big as Germany from north to south. And yet it's made up of these tiny little islands they're about 10, 20, 30 miles apart, maybe more as you go further north. Yeah, more like 30 miles apart. And these are not seagoing people. These are Melanesian people who don't have a big seafaring tradition. So each island is quite isolated, and it has its own little mini culture. So it's not like they're going back and forth between different islands. So within Vanuatu, so every island is kind of its own little world, its own little, not country, but very different from each other. So what you learn on one island, you can't necessarily apply to all the islands. So our first stop was the southernmost island of the chain, which is called Anatom. And it's very jungly, it's very thick, jungly, and people living in very simple houses with materials that you can just get out of the woods next to your house. But there's this underlining feeling of how different it is. So one thing is, fascinating place. It used to be a colony of England and France. As far as I know, it's the only place England and France ever cooperated on anything. And it was known as the condominium government. But the joke is it was the pandemonium government. And it's been an independent country since the 70s, but that legacy remains in the fact that 90% of people that I met spoke the island language, English, French, and the language Bislama, beautiful language. It's kind of like pidgin English. So what that means is you can go to this completely different National Geographic type place, where just a primal place, and yet you could talk to everybody. And I could talk to them in English, thank goodness, because I didn't, it's due to their language skills, not mine. The Swiss sailor, one of the Swiss sailors we knew, he preferred French. They could just switch into French for him. So it was very accessible superficially. So you think, wow, this is great. We can talk to everybody. We can understand the culture. But the longer you spend there, the more you understand what's under the surface. So just a quick example. That first island we got to, Anatom, we have a little cruising guide, and it said, oh, yeah, this is a good hike you can do not very far away from the village. So we went to the village and we asked, there's 4 men sitting there that we came across. And we said, oh, we heard there's a waterfall. Can you tell us the way to the waterfall? Would we like to go there? And they fall silent, and they're all looking at each other. And nobody comes up with an answer for a long time. And you're wondering, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with the waterfall? And the first guy finally goes, well, the waterfall's really far. And the second guy goes, yeah. And it's not a good track. It's pretty dangerous to get up there. And the third guy looks at them and goes, yeah, it's also private property. And then the fourth guy, you feel like they're slowly getting at the truth. And the fourth guy finally comes out with, and the spirits will get you. So and we had to ask him, so this island, there's very strong belief in the spirits. I think it's the ancestors that are there. So they weren't actually against us going to the waterfall, but they were truly worried for our safety that A, we wouldn't get lost, and B, we wouldn't, fall on a rock, but C, that the spirits wouldn't get us. And so to finally, we solved this problem with their help. They got us 2 guides, in fact. So the first guide was a guy whose family owns that first piece of land. Now, this is just, to us, it's jungle with a little foot trail going through it. To him, it's clearly his, he knows the beginning and the end of this land that has no fences. And the first guy, his family owned that land, so he could get us safely across that piece of land, so the spirits would be okay with us, and take us up to the invisible boundary to the next property line, where the second guide then took over and took us to the waterfall and kept us safe. And just that was just a little blink into the belief system there. And then when we went to the next island, Erromango, there was another hike we wanted to do. And by then we thought, we've learned what to do. So we go up to the village and say, we really like to do this hike. Could you perhaps help us find a guide? And they look at us and they look at each other and they're like, why do you need a guide? Just go up there. So it's totally different on every different island. Just a fascinating place.
Oh, that's great. And I love that, because the attitude is when traveling is obviously, yes, we want to explore, but also to respect the local tradition and the local area. And you were trying to do everything. And I think what's funny in these places, I've come across this too, is the people really want to help you, and everyone's mostly 99.9% of people are wonderful, right? And they want to help you, and they really do want to prevent you from probably just messing up and being foreigners, offending the spirits or offending somebody, and they're doing it in a sort of caring manner. So that's great. And I wanted to ask you about Panama as well, because your novel The Silver Spider is based around the Panama Canal, and I find it funny because I live near a canal in Bath in England, which is nothing like the Panama Canal. And I feel like the word should not be used for 2 such different things. So tell us a bit about the Panama Canal and Panama. I know it's a big topic, but what inspired you to write about that area in particular?
Yeah, Panama is such an amazing place. I mean, I can say that about every place we go to, yes, of course, and it's everybody in its own special way, but Panama, and even the canal is a big part of it. Obviously, that's what physically brought us there. And that's what about Panama. But Panama is just, I couldn't almost not write, not let my imagination go wild there, because first of all, you've got all the cultures of the world mixed. You've got indigenous people. You've got the ancestors of the Spanish people who've come. You have, because of the building of the canal, you have a large Chinese population that was brought over, mostly that came over during the French initial digging of the canal. Then the Americans took over back in the turn of the last century to building the canal. And their biggest labor force was the Afro-Caribbeans from Barbados, Jamaica, from Trinidad, from many places in the Caribbean that attracted people to come in. And all these cultures had to mix in a place like I haven't seen anywhere else. And I haven't been to Brazil. And from my image of Brazil is that it's an equally mixed place, that you basically have every color of the rainbow represented in mankind and womankind. So that was absolutely fascinating. And the canal, I'm not an engineer, but I still couldn't help but being amazed by the whole thing. But as a former archaeologist. I'm now a teacher, but I started out as an archaeologist. The canal actually is what we have to get across the isthmus. But the fascinating thing that I didn't know was the Spaniards came in. In fact, Columbus was the first outsider to so-called, quote unquote, discover Panama. I think it was his second journey. He stopped there. And very soon, within decades of his explorations, Spaniards came and they basically conquered, right, the whole Central and South America. And they saw Panama the same way we do. Aha, here's this isthmus, the shortest way across these continents rather than going all the way around Cape Horn. So they didn't have a canal, but they built the Camino Real. So it's actually, you can go today and see the cobblestone path that kind of disappears into the jungle that was built in the 1600s by the Spaniards. And why did they build it? They were basically robbing South America of all the gold and silver they could find. There was incredibly productive silver mines in Bolivia. I think La Mina is one of them. There's another one. Those plundered treasures of the native people, who is a whole sad story in itself, those plundered treasures were brought up on the Pacific side by ship, and then back in the 1600s, put on mule trains and brought across the isthmus exactly the same way we have the canal, in the spirit of the thing, across the isthmus, and then reloaded onto ships waiting on the Caribbean side. So my first introduction to that was the town of Portobello, where you can see they have a customs house where they would count the gold and silver. And apparently 1/3 of the world's silver at that time was passing through that very customs house. And you can go there today. Mm-hmm. So being there, being confronted by the semi-modern Panama Canal and the history that goes behind it, as an imaginative person, in no time I had a story spinning of the Spaniard who stumbles across part of this treasure coming up from South America. That's the silver spider, mixed with the worker on the Panama Canal who now discovers that buried treasure, so to speak, that was never gotten out by the Spanish conquistadors. So in 1912, we've got our canal worker discovering it. And in the modern era, we have his great grandson sailing innocently to Panama, not even knowing the connection, and eventually coming across that same treasure, which is not the point of Panama for everybody. But being in a place like that, you almost can't help but coming up with just fun stories of what might happen if, and combining all of what you're seeing play out in front of your eyes, in a sense, even the history you can still see there.
Oh, I love that. And of course, I write, all my fiction is set based on my travels too. So I love that. And we'll obviously have links to all your books in the show notes. But this is the Books and Travel Show. So apart from your own books, what are a few that you recommend around sailing or travel in general?
Absolutely. I have. You can't carry much on a boat, but one book that I took on with me the whole time was a book I've owned since I was 16. It's called Maiden Voyage by Tanya Abbey. And she, at I think 17 or 18, set off to sail around the world and became the youngest person, and I think the youngest woman, in addition, to sail around the world. She did it in the 80s. Fantastic book. And it's very much her emotional journey, a young woman growing up, difficult family life, setting off on this incredibly difficult adventure to do by yourself. So that is just an inspiring book, whether you're an armchair adventurer or you're a sailor. Other books for sailing and the Pacific, Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer. I read his Fatuhiva when I was a kid. My dad read it and he gave it to me. And that's an island in the Marquesas. It's basically the only way you can get there is by your own boat. There's one other way you can get on a cargo ship and go there, but there's no other way to get there. And Thor Heyerdahl spent a year living there in the 50s, I believe. And of course, his book Kon-Tiki, where he sailed across part of the Pacific in a reproduction craft. His theories have been proven completely wrong, but to me, that spirit, that let's go out and discover it's just on every page. So I love those. For fiction, I actually love Jimmy Buffett's book. We think of him as a singer, but he's written a couple of books, including A Salty Piece of Land. Now, it's not Shakespeare. It's pretty far-fetched. It's a little bit zany, but it's just such fun reading. And it includes places like the beautiful lighthouse on Amadei in New Caledonia. So that's another one. Finally, for sailing there's a great book called Sea Change by Peter Nichols. And he's he was sailing across the Atlantic on a very small wooden boat. This is in the wake of his divorce. And this is, I think it was published in the 90s or early 2000s. So it's just his account, his memoir of sailing alone across the Atlantic and working through the emotions of that at the same time that his boat is developing problem after problem and eventually starts sinking. And it's just it pulls everything together without being sensationalistic about it. So those are my top sailing reads. And I'll also just rattle off 3 quick titles for people interested in Panama. So much fascinating things there. There's The Path Between the Seas by David McCullough, which is the story of the building of the Panama Canal. It's 700 pages. I read it for those 28 days that we sailed from the Galapagos to Marquesas. Great book. Zone Policeman 88. It's a very strange title. Zone Policeman 88 by Harry Frank is a free book on Amazon. He, in the 1912-ish, was writing a census of the Panama Canal workers. And he went around, it's his memoir of visiting all the different people of all those cultures that I mentioned, working on the canal in different ways. So I think it's Project Gutenberg that brings old titles and makes them free. Zone Policeman 88 is one of those. And another one is, last one, On the Spanish Main by John Masefield. The Panama Canal workers in the early 1900s were reading that eagerly. He wrote about the time of Sir Francis Drake coming and plundering the Spanish loot coming across the isthmus many centuries before. And it's about 100 years old to us now, that book. And that is also free on places like Amazon, and not only on Amazon, obviously, On the Spanish Main. So that is my top 10 list or top 6 or whatever that came out to be.
Oh, that's brilliant. And you've given us a lot to think about. So where can people find you and your books online?
I have a website, nslavinski.com. So N like Nadine, Slavinski.com. And that's where my books are, whether it's my fiction books like The Silver Spider or my nonfiction like Pacific Crossing Notes, or I have some books on homeschooling for sailors, if you happen to be setting off tomorrow with your children. And people who just want the armchair adventure, our sailing blog is namani@sea.org. So Namani is basically our initials, Nadine, Marcus, Nikki, Namani at, all spelled out, sea.org. You can relive our voyage if you were interested in doing so.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your time, Nadine. That was great.
Great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining me today on the Books and Travel podcast. I hope you found a moment of escape. You can find the episode show notes at booksandtravel.page. And if you enjoy thrillers set in international locations, download one of my books for free at jfpen.com/free. Happy travels until next time.